It begins with a silence, not the silence of absence, but of arrival. A silence stretched thin across the Pacific, a sea so vast it could swallow continents. And into that silence they came, not by accident, not blown by chance winds or adrift like scattered seeds. No, they came with intent, with stars etched in memory and a direction passed down in chance. The ancestors of the Maori were voyagers, engineers of movement, navigators of open oceans before most of the world even dreamed of crossing a river. They came from the west, from the green highlands of Taiwan, where their ancestors, Austronesian-speaking horticulturalists, first stepped into the current of time that would carry them across an entire ocean. Around 5,000 years ago, the great Austronesian expansion began, and from that point, the human map changed forever. These weren't mere migrants. They were cultivators of destiny. Across the Philippines, into island Southeast Asia, through the jungle-thick coastlines of Indonesia, they pressed forward. Every stop carved away at their original diversity. Every island crossed narrowed the genome. 1,000 voices slowly distilled into a singular pulse. And then, they reached the edge of what the ancient world thought possible. The Lapita culture, named not by their own people, but by archaeologists centuries later, emerged as the bridge between Southeast Asia and the deep Pacific. They left behind fragments, dentate-stamped pottery, obsidian flakes, fishhooks made from shell. But their real legacy? It lived in blood. Their descendants kept sailing, east into the heart of what we now call Polynesia. By 1000 BCE, they had reached the islands of Tonga, Samoa, and Fiji. Beyond it lay remote Oceania, 1,000 islands scattered like stars, and no compass to find them. Only memory, stars, and ancestral logic. Eventually, they found Hawaii, the symbolic homeland of Maori oral tradition. And finally, around 1250 to 1350 AD, they reached what would become the final major landmass settled by humans, Aotearoa, New Zealand. They didn't drift here. The voyage to Aotearoa was deliberate, planned, and massive. The oral histories speak of great waka, ocean-going canoes, carrying families, knowledge, gods, and fire. Genetic evidence backs this up. Ancient skeletons from sites like Wairau Bar show mitochondrial diversity not found in small, isolated groups, but in large, organized migrations. Several maternal lineages, multiple distinct origins. This was no accident. This was a final movement, a genetic closing chapter. The Maori were not a branch. They were the culmination of every wave before. But with every step farther from the origin, something was lost. That's the paradox of exploration. You expand the map, but shrink the genome. This long sequence of migrations, from Taiwan to Tahiti to Aotearoa, created repeated founder effects, repeated genetic bottlenecks. With each island, only a subset of the original population moved on. Only a fragment of a genome made the journey. Genes drifted. Diversity shrank. Some variants vanished altogether. And in the cold, fertile lands of New Zealand, this isolation would become extreme. But it is from this very bottleneck that uniqueness is born. The Maori don't just carry ancient genes, they carry ancient history. Locked inside every chromosome is a record of the greatest human migration ever undertaken, the longest oceanic expansion in the archaeological record, and its final sentence was written on these shores. So if you've made it this far, tell me this. Would your DNA survive 1,000 years of open ocean? Would your genome still speak if everything else was forgotten? Think about that. And if you're still with us, maybe it's time you subscribed. We've only just opened the first chapter. 6 more parts to go. And what comes next will change how you see Ancestry forever. She had no name, no carved headstone, no preserved monument. And yet she left a genetic fingerprint so precise, it still echoes in the blood of nearly every Maori alive today. It's called the Polynesian Motif, a rare mitochondrial marker, passed from mother to child, generation after generation. And what makes it extraordinary is just how uniform it is. We're not talking about thousands of variants. We're talking about one maternal lineage, B4A1A1. That's it. 94% of all Maori carry it. Now stop and think about that. Imagine if every person in your country, every schoolchild, every grandparent, every artist, farmer, leader, all descended from a single woman. That's not fiction. That's what the mitochondrial DNA is telling us. And here's where it gets even stranger. This isn't just some boring code in a lab. This motif has a scar, a missing sequence. 9 base pairs gone. A tiny deletion in region V of the empty DNA control loop. But this deletion is what allows scientists to track it, like a trail of breadcrumbs across the Pacific, from Taiwan to the Philippines to Samoa to Aotearoa. That deletion, the so-called Polynesian Motif, survives the entire way. Not diluted, not overridden, surviving isolation, surviving time. And if that doesn't give you chills, consider this. Ancient skeletons uncovered at Wairau Bar, dated to nearly 700 years ago, carried the exact same maternal lineage as Maori today. No mutation drift, no deviation, the same mitochondrial signature, from their bones to your bloodstream. But how is that even possible? How can a population carry so little diversity in their maternal DNA? The answer lies in the logic of migration. When people travel across vast oceans in small groups, they don't take every gene with them. They take what fits in a canoe. And as they settle new islands, only the DNA of the survivors is passed on. What doesn't make the journey disappears. So when those ancestral waka arrived in Aotearoa, only a fraction of the original Polynesian genetic pool made landfall. And from that moment, every birth, every generation, every memory was tied to her, the unknown mother whose mitochondria became the genetic anchor of an entire people. Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a family photo that stretches back 5, 6, maybe 7 generations? Now imagine a genetic photo that goes back 30 generations, unchanged. That's what this is. The Polynesian motif is more than a mutation. It's a living photograph, printed in blood. But here's where the mystery deepens. Scientists have searched far and wide for diversity in Maori mitochondrial DNA. They've sequenced full genomes, hunted for subclades, even uncovered some tiny branches like B4A1A3 and B4A1A1A5. But even these are just variants of the same root. No other maternal lineage shows up. No secondary origin. Just her. This kind of mitochondrial uniformity is rare. You don't see it in Africa. Not in Europe. Not even in mainland Asia. It only happens in places where isolation meets resilience, where survival means everything, and inheritance is not genetic, but ancestral. And if that doesn't raise the hair on your arms, ask yourself this. What kind of life did she live? Was she a navigator? A healer? Did she choose Aotearoa, or did fate choose her? Would you even be here if she hadn't survived that crossing? And now, here's the twist no one talks about. Even though paternal DNA in Maori is far more diverse, blending Melanesian, Asian, and later European contributions, maternal DNA stayed loyal. No fusion, no breakdown, just a perfectly preserved code, passed silently from mother to daughter for over 700 years. It's almost as if the maternal line, unlike the chaotic, interwoven paternal history, was shielded, protected, made sacred. In Te Ao Maori, the concept of Wakapapa isn't just lineage, it's connection. And perhaps that's why this genetic signature was preserved so strongly, not just by biology, but by belief, by story, by the sacred. So before we move on, ask yourself, who are your mothers? What did they endure so you could exist? And how much of them still lives inside of you? If this question made you pause, even for a second, don't just keep scrolling. Subscribe now. There's more to this journey than you've been told. He stepped off the canoe with fire in his lungs and salt in his blood. He was not alone, but his story would take a different path. If the Maori maternal line is a single, echoing drumbeat, steady, consistent, the paternal line is a thunderclap, sudden, complex, woven from multiple worlds. And here's the twist. It doesn't trace the same journey. Where most Maori maternal DNA points cleanly to East Asia, over 65% of Maori paternal DNA leads elsewhere, to the dark green islands of Melanesia, to New Guinea, to the Solomons, to a deeper, more ancient ocean. But how? If both mothers and fathers were part of the same voyages, why don't their genes tell the same story? Because history doesn't always move evenly. Because migrations are human, messy, uneven, filled with rules no one wrote down. Let me ask you something personal. How many stories in your own family have been passed down only from your mother's side, or only from your father's? What gets remembered and what gets lost? In the genetic history of the Maori, the fathers tell a far more tangled tale. As Polynesian explorers passed through Melanesia, they didn't just stop for food or supplies. They met people, traded, intermarried, and the DNA remembers. Austronesian men may have brought their boats, their crops, and their stars, but Melanesian men brought their blood into those lineages. And here's the scientific clue. Y chromosome haplogroups like C2 and K, distinctly Melanesian, show up in the vast majority of Maori male lines, not just in Aotearoa, but across Polynesia, Samoa, Tonga, Rapa Nui, Hawaii. Meanwhile, East Asian Y DNA, haplogroups like O1, accounts for only 28%. The math is undeniable. The migration was not just eastward, it was also deeply absorptive. So, was it a matter of cultural blending? Strategic alliances? Were Melanesian men invited into voyaging clans? Or were they captured, integrated, or chosen for skills? We may never know the details, but the pattern is unmistakable. Polynesia was not built by one people alone. It was forged by fusion. And then came the third wave. When Europeans arrived in the Pacific, the admixture didn't stop. It accelerated. Today, nearly 40% of Maori men carry European Y chromosome lineages. That means in just 250 years, the Maori paternal genetic structure was rewritten again. Think about that for a second. Thousands of years of Austronesian and Melanesian interweaving. Then in just 10 generations, the European imprint crashes in. But here's what's remarkable. Despite these layers, the core Melanesian signal survives. Strong, persistent, unmistakable. Imagine you're mapping a river. The maternal line flows like a single, unbroken stream. But the paternal side? It's a branching delta. East Asia, Melanesia, Europe. 3 currents, 1 identity. And maybe that's why it matters so much. Because in every Maori man's genome is a record of negotiation. Between ancestry and adaptation. Between isolation and connection. You see, science often talks about Y DNA as cold data. But it's not. It's a journal, written in the ink of fathers. What if your father's DNA carried traces of people you've never heard of? What if your last name was the only thing left from an ancestor's journey across an entire sea? This isn't just biology. It's biography. So when we talk about Maori uniqueness, we're not just talking about ancient Polynesians. We're talking about the men who stood on Melanesian soil, long before Aotearoa was even imagined. And still, today, their chromosomes whisper through generations, through sons, through memory. Ask yourself, what did your father carry that never got told? What might still live in you? Not as stories, but as structure. If that question caught you off guard, maybe it's time you stayed for more. Click subscribe. There's still more history hiding in the bloodline. It sounds like something clinical. Genetic bottleneck. But behind that phrase is one of the most dramatic survival stories the human genome has ever told. Picture this. An island so distant that even birds struggled to reach it. A new world with no humans, no predators, no paths. And into that untouched land came a few hundred people, maybe less. Now ask yourself, what happens to a gene pool when it's poured into a container that small? It's not just reduced, it's reshaped. The Maori didn't arrive in waves of thousands. Their founding population may have numbered only in the low hundreds, possibly fewer than 100 women. That's not a migration. That's a genetic gamble. And the effects of that gamble are still written in Maori DNA today. One of the clearest signs? The loss of heterozygosity, a fancy term that basically means this. Many genetic variants that existed in their ancestral homeland simply didn't survive the voyage. It's like copying a book by hand, over and over, but starting from a version where several pages are already missing. Each generation is a new draft, but the missing pages? They never return. Now, let me show you what that looks like. Open a Maori genome on a chromosome browser, and you'll see something strange. Long, uninterrupted stretches of identical DNA. Like comb teeth, evenly spaced, unbroken. That's the visual signature of a population bottleneck. In simple terms, it means fewer ancestors contributed to the gene pool. Fewer mutations, less variation, more uniformity. And that comes with both risks and revelations. Here's the risk. With fewer variants, the chance of founder mutations increases. These are gene changes that would normally be rare, but in a small, isolated population, they become common. In Maori, we've seen this with genes like MAOA, CDH1, and NPHS1, linked to everything from mood regulation to stomach cancer to childhood kidney disease. They didn't evolve to cause harm. They just happened to exist in those early settlers, and isolation made them stick. Now here's the revelation. This same bottleneck also preserved genetic clarity. In a world where most populations are melting pots of 50 ancestral threads, Maori DNA is like a time capsule, a clear window into the last phase of the Polynesian expansion. That's why their genome is so valuable to researchers. It hasn't been diluted the way continental populations have. It still holds the structure of migration frozen in place. But here's what no dataset can show: the emotional cost. Imagine being part of a lineage where you can trace back every maternal mutation to a single ancestor, where your entire medical risk profile was shaped by decisions made 800 years ago, during a storm in the middle of the ocean. Does that give you power, or take it away? This is the part that makes you stop scrolling. Because when you realize how few people shaped the entire genetic makeup of an indigenous nation, and how close they came to being genetically erased, it stops being academic. It becomes personal. What if your family only had 50 ancestors left? Would your children carry the same traits? The same strengths? The same vulnerabilities? That's what the Maori bottleneck did. It preserved a people, but it also narrowed their options. And every generation since has carried the consequences. Even today, genomic studies show just how different Maori diversity is compared to other Polynesian groups. Samoans and Tongans show greater variation. Maori sit at the eastern extreme, more isolated, more homogeneous, more defined by the genes that survived. And yet, in that bottleneck, something extraordinary happened. A unique identity emerged. One shaped not by abundance, but by endurance. By what was kept, not by what was lost. And maybe that's the deeper story. That a small group, arriving at the edge of the world, with only fragments of a larger legacy, still managed to create something powerful, distinct, whole. Maori. So before we move on, I want to leave you with this question. If your identity had to be rebuilt from just a few voices, would your story still survive? If you're still watching, you're part of a rare group, curious, engaged, connected to something bigger. Click subscribe, because in the next chapter, we explore what those preserved genes did to help or hurt. There's a strange contradiction hidden deep in the Maori genome, one that scientists still struggle to explain, because some of the genes that helped their ancestors survive are now making people sick. Let's rewind. Centuries ago, life in the Pacific was brutal and unpredictable. Long ocean voyages, droughts, cyclones, famine. You didn't know when your next harvest would come, or if it ever would. Under conditions like that, only one kind of gene thrived, the kind that could store energy like a fortress. Fast forward to today, and those same genes haven't gone anywhere. But the world has changed, and the old defenses? They've become new dangers. One of the most studied examples is a variant in the CREBRF gene, common in Maori and Pacific Islanders. This tiny genetic switch does something wild. It increases body weight significantly, but also lowers the risk of type 2 diabetes. Let that sink in. More fat, but less diabetes. In almost any other population, those two things go hand in hand. But here, they split apart. Why? Because that gene evolved for survival, not for comfort. It likely gave early Polynesians a way to bulk up quickly, store calories, survive lean seasons, and still regulate blood sugar efficiently. In an island world where one failed crop could mean starvation, that mutation wasn't a liability. It was a superpower. But today, with high-calorie diets, sedentary lifestyles, and urban stress, that same gene is being dragged into modern disease stats. Obesity rates are high. Cardiovascular issues follow. But the genetic story behind it, that is ancient. And CREBRF is just one thread. Other genes tell similar stories, like the amylin gene, involve in how the body produces insulin. In a recent study, Maori individuals with rare promoter mutations in this gene had a drastically higher risk of developing diabetes, a disease that now disproportionately affects Maori communities. So what's happening here? It's not about weakness. It's about genetic mismatch. When your body is built for feast and famine cycles, and the famine never comes, the survival code gets confused. And confusion, in biology, can become pathology. Let's go even deeper. Maori also carry a unique variant in a gene called BTNL9, linked to lipid metabolism. In plain terms, this gene affects how your body handles cholesterol. Maori and other Pacific carriers often show low HDL, good cholesterol, and high triglycerides. That's a recipe for early heart problems, even in young adults. But here's the catch. This variant is almost non-existent outside Polynesian populations. So is it broken? Or is it just misunderstood? Because again, in a high-activity, low-food environment, this mutation may have been protective, a clever metabolic strategy. Today, in a different nutritional reality, it's been miscast as defective, but its origins are anything but. And we haven't even touched on diseases beyond metabolism. Some rare conditions, like hereditary gastric cancer and congenital nephrotic syndrome, have been linked to specific mutations found predominantly in Maori populations, not because they're more vulnerable, but because isolation preserved mutations that would have otherwise disappeared in larger gene pools. So the real question is, what if your greatest ancestral advantage became your future risk? It's not science fiction. It's genomic memory, and it's playing out in clinics across New Zealand right now. Doctors are beginning to realize standard genetic tests based on European genomes don't always apply to Maori patients because their gene map is different. Their history is different. Their adaptations were written under stars, not fluorescent lights, which leads to this moment. We now have a choice. Either we treat these genes as anomalies, or we treat them as insight. We can use this knowledge to build better, culturally tailored healthcare, or ignore it, and let mismatched medicine keep failing generations. So ask yourself, if your genes were forged by survival, wouldn't you want the world to understand them fully? If you're still watching, you're not here by accident. Click subscribe. You've just seen how survival and suffering can share the same sequence. And in the next part, we go beyond the biology, into the soul of the genome. Some call it data, others call it ancestry. But in Te Maori, the Maori world, DNA is something else entirely. It is tapu. That means sacred, protected, bound by spiritual law. Not just strands of code, but strands of connection. Western science sees the genome as a puzzle, something to break apart, decode, analyze under microscopes. But Maori see it differently. DNA isn't just information. It's Wakapapa genealogy. It's the living thread between the present and the ancient, between the physical and the spiritual. Let me ask you something personal. If you had a map that led directly to your ancestors, not metaphorically, but literally, would you hand it over to a stranger? That's the kind of question Maori communities are asking today. Not because they're against science, but because they know what's at stake when sacred knowledge is handled without consent. And the stakes are high, because in Maori belief, every part of the body, including blood, tissue, bone, and even genes, carries Maori life force and Wairua spirit. That's not poetry. That's principle. So when researchers extract DNA for sequencing, they're not just taking cells. They're touching tapu. In some traditions, even naming an ancestor in the wrong context is forbidden. Now imagine extracting their DNA and publishing it in a scientific journal. Can you feel the tension? This isn't about resisting discovery. It's about demanding respect. Because here's the truth. For centuries, indigenous bodies were studied like specimens, not human beings. Collected, stored, analyzed, but never consulted. Today, Maori are reclaiming that narrative. They're leading genomic projects like Aotearoa Variome and Itangata Keitua, built around Maori data sovereignty. That means Maori control over Maori DNA, where samples are stored, who has access, what questions are asked, and most importantly, who benefits. Because it's not just about sequencing a gene. It's about what that gene means. To a wano, to a hapu, to a people who never separated science from soul in the first place. And here's where it gets even deeper. Maori art, carving, and weaving often reflect patterns of interconnection. The double helix, that spiraling ladder of life, it resembles ruatau, traditional woven forms that symbolize layered knowledge. Ancestral wisdom encoded in shape, not symbol. So when Maori look at DNA, they don't see novelty. They see continuity. And maybe that's what Western science is only beginning to understand. That genomics isn't just about what we're made of. It's about who we're made from. Let's bring this down to earth. Imagine a young Maori boy taking a genetic test in school. He finds out his blood carries rare variants found nowhere else on Earth. But does he also learn the story behind those genes? The voyages, the names, the responsibility? Or is he told only the numbers, not the names? Science without story is half a truth. And for Maori, truth has always included the mana, the dignity, of those who came before. So here's the question you need to wrestle with. Can a genome be sacred? Can information have a soul? Because if you don't believe it can, then maybe you haven't looked closely enough. And if this part of the story moved you, even slightly, then don't leave now. Click subscribe, because in the final chapter, we connect everything. The journey, the genes, the memory, and the legacy. The map ends here, but the story doesn't. When most of the world thought the Pacific was empty, silent, unreachable, the ancestors of the Maori knew better. They didn't just sail into the unknown. They redrew the boundaries of what humans could become. But here's the part no one tells you. The Maori genome doesn't just preserve that legacy, it embodies it. Because hidden in their DNA is more than ancestry. There are echoes of every island crossed, every alliance forged, every loss carried. Their genetic code is not a trace. It's a living map of the Pacific's final migration. Think about this. Over 3,000 islands stand scattered across the Pacific Ocean, the vastest water desert on Earth. And yet, the ancestors of the Maori linked them without compasses, without metal, without written language. Just stars, currents, and memory. How do you encode that in a double helix? Start here. Mitochondrial markers from East Asia. Then layer in paternal signals from Melanesia. Now fold in 700 years of geographic isolation in Aotearoa, and a late wave of European contact. What you get is a genome that doesn't match any other on the planet. Here's something wild. Recent studies discovered Polynesian mitochondrial haplogroups inside ancient remains, not in New Zealand, but in Brazil. Yes, Brazil. Botacudo skulls, dated centuries before trans-Pacific contact, carrying the same 9 base pair deletion, the Polynesian Motif, we've seen all the way back in Taiwan and forward into Aotearoa. So what does that mean? Could Maori ancestors, or their East Polynesian cousins, have reached South America before Columbus? Could they have made the return voyage and vanished from the official record? We don't know yet. But that question alone turns everything upside down. And it leads us to this. Maori DNA is not just unique. It is global. It connects oceans. It challenges timelines. It's proof that the Pacific wasn't a barrier, it was a bridge. But don't mistake this for fantasy. The genetic patterns are real. The migrations were deliberate. And the story isn't finished. Because here's the truth. The Maori genome isn't a relic of the past. It's a testament to survival and adaptability, to navigating trauma, contact, colonization, loss, and still holding onto identity. Even now, Maori DNA holds clues we're only beginning to understand. Rare disease mutations, resilience factors, immune adaptations found nowhere else. Not better, not worse, distinct. So what happens next? That depends on us. Whether we treat this code as curiosity or as cultural inheritance. Whether genomic research becomes a tool of healing or another chapter in exploitation. But here's what's clear. The Maori story didn't end when they reached Aotearoa. It didn't end with colonization. And it won't end with a genome sequence. Because Maori identity isn't just something in the past. It's transmitted forward through language, land, lineage, and yes, DNA. Let me ask you something. If your ancestors had crossed 6,000 kilometers of open water just to give you a future, what would you do with it? Would you forget it? Or would you honor it? This is the edge of the map, but not the edge of the story. And if this journey moved you, even a little, then don't let it vanish. Subscribe, because the next migration is in the mind.